Hello. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Tibi Gallis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Auschwitz Institute. We are one of your hosts today, and I would like to start by thanking you for coming to this meeting. This has been in the works for quite a while now, and it mostly meant lots of papers and lots of meetings, so we are very honored to see that it's actually becoming reality. What I would like to tell you for a second is what the Auschwitz Institute is, one of your hosts. We are a not-for-profit that exists both here in the United States and in Poland that deals with supporting genocide prevention efforts. How we do that, you ask? It's through assisting governments in capacity building around the world on genocide prevention policy. That means helping governments increase the knowledge within their ranks related to the issues that we confront through genocide prevention, and also by assisting them set up institutions that will make sure that both nationally, regionally, and internationally will contribute to this agenda. We are very glad that so many people are interested in this work, and we are very honored to see that this is becoming very much a movement, a thing that this community has been hoping for now more or less several decades. Today is also a day of celebration for many, many reasons. I would like to point to, in your programs, to the fact that today the Auschwitz Institute will have the honor to honor Dr. Professor Barbara Half for her contribution to this field, and we would like to invite you to be present at lunchtime for that ceremony. We are also celebrating because the Auschwitz Institute last week had the chance to sign with the African Union Commission a memorandum of understanding which makes the Auschwitz Institute the implementer of the EU Commission's strategy for redeveloping its genocide prevention system, both internally and in connection with its member states. That is for us the result of a very long work, and it poses new exciting challenges that we hope that today's dialogue will contribute to finding solutions to. So I don't want to go on, and I would like to actually introduce you my co-host today. Sorry, I'm still influenced a bit probably by the Oscars, but it's the co-host today, Sherry Rosenberg, who is one of the distinguished professors at Cardozo Law School, and who is an assistant clinical professor of law and the director of the Human Rights and Genocide Clinic and Program in Holocaust, Genocide and Human Rights Studies here. Her work has been an inspiration for many of us who look to rethinking international law and finding those dimensions of international law that support very much genocide prevention practice policy in the field. Sherry, please come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tibi, for that very nice introduction. I'd like to join Tibi in welcoming everybody here today. I don't want to go on for too long because I would like to get to the opening remarks that we will hear from Honorable Roméo Dallaire. You can find out more, and so on that note, I'm going to leave it to you can find out more about the program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies here at Cardozo Law School by going to our website, as well as the work that we do in the Human Rights and Genocide Prevention Clinic, which is the only one of its kind in the country, where we take a holistic look at issues of prevention, protection, and rebuilding as a continuum in this effort of preventing, and I'm going to use the word mass atrocity, and we'll get into terminology throughout the day. So now I have the honor of introducing the Honorable Roméo Dallaire, who will speak to us today via Skype, because he is people will be disappointed, and I'm sorry, and he will speak for himself, but he is a member of Parliament in Canada, And while he was booked and reserved and a hotel reservation, was required to attend to an important vote in Parliament and was actually very generous to agree to join us today via modern technology, which is actually a very good way to kick off the day, since this afternoon we are going to speak about the ways in which new technologies are transforming the ways in which we look at and deal with atrocities. So it all comes together. But it really is an honor to introduce Honorable Roméo Dallaire. He held the rank of Lieutenant General and became Assistant Deputy Minister in the Department of National Defense in Canada. In 1994, as I think many of you know, General Dallaire commanded the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, UNAMIR. As we all know, unfortunately, the UN, essentially due to various reasons, the peacekeeping mission there pulled out a lot of its forces. And General Dallaire did everything he could to garner the resources he needed to help roll back and avert what eventually was this horrible genocide that we all know about, but to no avail. Instead, his marching orders were to come back home, and he said no. And he did what he could whilst he was there. And with his small remaining force, while he'll be modest, he saved lives, and saving even one life is of monumental importance. So for me, I'm not one who likes to gush, really, but to me, he's a man of utmost courage, humanity, humility, graciousness, all of this on top of a sharp intellect. And I can go on, but I will not. I have a lot of admiration. Since then, since his return back from his command in Rwanda, he wrote the award-winning book, Shake Hands with the Devil, which I'm sure many of you have read, and if you have not, I encourage you all to read it, and is now a member of the Canadian Parliament, which is why he's not able to be with us here in person. He's also a champion for human rights and is currently writing a book and advocating around the issue of child soldiers. So before I turn it over, because I know many of you are here to hear General Dallaire, I have to just acknowledge with gratitude the hard work, because I know some of you may leave after you hear Roméo Dallaire. So I want to acknowledge with gratitude the hard work of a number of people who made today and yesterday, and you forgot to give the hashtag, a reality. Yesterday was a working meeting that will constitute, as well as today, a book, an edited volume on the issue of preventing atrocities. Shashi Kara, who was recently with the UN, was a consultant on this project. Shashi has been instrumental in conceptualizing and organizing this two-day event, and in particular, he brought to this project his keen knowledge of technology, human rights, and UN practice and procedure. Alex Zucker, who's the director of Alumni and Communications at AIPR, Auschwitz Institute, brought his keen intellect to bear on the organization of the edited volume that we will be creating. Shoshana Smolin, she is a fellow with the Program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Study, who bore the brunt of organizing today's meeting. And Pamela, whose last name I cannot ever pronounce, Takafman, I think, who's also, she'll tell us afterwards, is also a fellow with the Program in Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. Angel Sujipto, who's a hugely impressive undergraduate student at Hunter College, who's been with us from the very beginning. Professor Jim Waller, who's very, very generously helped us to conceptualize this entire project and offered to assist us in any way he could. And last but not least, the man who embodies this conference, who really bore the brunt of all the stress and two different bosses, Daniel Mintzner, who's the U.S. Program Officer at the Auschwitz Institute. So with no further ado, there's a hashtag, which I don't even know what that means, but you people, it has something to do with tweeting. It's DeconstructPrev. Okay, DeconstructPrev for those who tweet. So with no further ado, thank you so much for coming.
Well, good morning, and I hope the communications are working well, and thank you for letting me join you this morning from the comfort of my apartment here in Ottawa, Canada. I'm here because we seem to enjoy creating political crises in our home states and maybe not learning the right lessons from other colleagues. So as the Deputy Chair of the Defense Committee, we had quite a complex situation yesterday that prevented me from joining you this morning. I am humbled to be in front of you today to give the opening remarks and maybe assist in setting the scene of the day, particularly when I see those who've been in the trenches of this whole prevention philosophy, notably Francis Deng and Ed Luck and Juan Mendez, with whom I have worked on the Secretary General's Advisory Board on Genocide Prevention. I would like to work from a text, if I may, giving, by the nature of starting today, a bit of the history, which I hope won't bore you today, and also project into the future, and end with an argument that I would like to make in regards to prevention and essentially create the link between the prevention and the rebuilding pillars. That is to say, the argument that rebuilding and prevention are instruments of capacity building and development, and in fact we see many of the same players who could be and should be engaged in both of those. And I would essentially argue that we cannot prevent atrocities of the future without also helping survivors and their neighbors recover from those of the past. We simply can't close the shop for inventory and start from scratch. We have a lot of baggage that is going to influence that future, and I argue that we've got to participate intimately in sorting out that baggage by the concepts of rebuilding and the linkage between that and prevention. So if I may, I'll go to the specifics of the text, and once again, thank you for being patient with the technology, and I hope it works out clear enough for you to understand, even though I'm not speaking in my mother tongue, which is Quebecois or 18th century French, but in North American English. I think at long last, mass atrocity prevention is the topic of the day. It may not seem like it at this moment, but to the veterans of this long and drawn-out battle, this shift is truly incredible. To truly appreciate this shift, we have to look back a bit and survey the territory behind us. I believe this will tell us a great deal about how far we have come and how far we still have to go. It may also give us new insights as to the expansive and at times counterintuitive scope of prevention. Violations of the norms of war have long been a part of our theoretical and legal lexicon. Arguably, this has been the case long before the Libya Code of 1863, the First Geneva Convention of 1864, and even before Henry Dunant first saw the ravages that befell the corpses littering the battlefield in Solferino in 1859. But I think that most people today would agree that mass atrocities, as they are presently understood, as part of a spectrum that accumulates in the incomprehensible horror of genocide, came to the fore as a result of the unimaginable crimes of the Second World War, of which the Holocaust is emblematic. That cataclysmic event expanded our conception of the violations of the norms of war, birthing the concept of war crimes and eventually protecting civilians under the laws of war. The shock of the Holocaust also gave us the language of crimes against humanity, which harked back to the December 1915 reaction of the Allies to the Armenian genocide, reborn and elaborated in the judgments of the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal. Perhaps most importantly, the Holocaust forced us to come to face with the persistence of genocide, the attempt to annihilate a whole race, nation, religion, or ethnic group by destroying all or some of its members throughout recorded history. It was not until after World War II that as a community of nations, and I beg to suggest as a community of peoples, formally signaled our moral and legal excruciating of genocide as a crime in the United Nations Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, essentially the Genocide Convention. We owe this instrument to the eminent Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, and I teach you nothing there, who himself lost 49 of his family members in the Holocaust, and who was the first to coin the term in his seminal 1944 work, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, Laws of Occupation, Analysis of Government, Proposals for Redress. The reason I bring up Raphael Lemkin, other than to pay tribute to his achievements, is because I want to make a point about the theory of prevention and our understanding of genocide and other mass atrocities. Mr. Lemkin said that genocide was effected through a synchronized attack, and I emphasize the term attack, on different aspects of life of a captive people. This definition does not at first glance depart too greatly from our present understanding of mass atrocities. That is, until we investigate further to see what Lemkin really meant by the action verb attack. When Lemkin said attack, he meant in the political field, by destroying institutions of self-government and imposing, in this case, a German pattern of administration, and through colonization by Germans. In the social field, by disrupting the social cohesion of the nation involved and killing or removing elements such as the intelligentsia, which provides spiritual leadership. In the cultural field, by prohibiting and destroying cultural institutions and cultural activities, by substituting vocational education for education in liberal arts in order to prevent humanistic thinking, which the occupant considers dangerous because it promotes national thinking. In the economic field, by shifting the wealth to Germans in the case, and by prohibiting the exercise of trade and occupation by people who do not promote Germanism without reservations. In the biological field, by a policy of depopulation and by promoting procreation of Germans in the occupied countries, and in the field of physical existence, by introducing a starvation rationing system for non-Germans, and by mass killings mainly of Jews, Poles, Slovenes, and Russians, and lastly, in the religious field, by interfering with the activities of the Church, which in many countries provides not only spiritual, but also national leadership. Mass atrocities are not only carried out through mass murder, they can also be carried out in the political field and in the social field, in the cultural field, in the economic field, and in the religious field and the biological fields. I'm trying to make and emphasize this point. Here I do not want to be too critical, but I believe Lemkin's vision has remained far ahead of our present understanding of mass atrocities and the patterns which precede them. Since World War II, we have been, with very few exceptions, focusing on the killing fields, the assault on physical existence. For example, our legislation on genocide criminalizes the killing of members of a group, the causing of serious bodily or mental harm, the prevention of births, and the forcible transfer of persons. The only clause of the Genocide Convention that comes close to approximating Lemkin's more expansive definition refers to the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about its protected group's physical destruction in whole or in part. I suspect that the emphasis in that clause is not on the conditions of life, but on the physical destruction of the group. Unfortunately, the same is true for the definitions of crimes against humanity and war crimes. In those cases, the only clauses that come close to approximating the scope of Lemkin's definition are the abolition, suspension, and inadmissibility in a court of law of the rights and actions of the nationals of the hostile party, or intentionally attacking buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, or charitable purposes, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, both of which are war crimes. The efficacy of these clauses is very much in question, though the treatment of the recent attacks on the cultural heritage of Muslims in Timbuktu by the International Criminal Court will invariably provide some clarity on the matter, and that's a matter of optimism. My point is that we have been looking at the issue possibly too narrowly. While that may be justified to some extent in the sphere of international criminal law, our myopia regarding mass atrocities is evident in the terms of many of our instruments of peace and security. The march of history is somewhat to blame for this. After the Genocide Convention came into effect, the international community turned a blind eye towards mass atrocities. The security of peoples came second, after the security not only of nations, but also of superpowers. Indeed, it took the international community also almost 50 years after the convention entered into force to acknowledge the existence of genocide, not only as a concept, but as a current reality within the international community at large, and particularly within a United Nations member state. The Rwandan genocide of 1994 provided a moment of reckoning for a number of reasons. It awoke the international community to the fact that even at the end of the 20th century, mass atrocities were still happening, and more importantly, that we must not stand by while they happened. The failures in Rwanda and Bosnia, Yugoslavia, awoke us from our slumber and forced us to look beyond the opaque shell of the state and into the very core of our shared humanity. It reminded us that it is the very existence of our shared humanity that is at risk in genocide. This is what it comes down to. This is what I experienced personally. Faced with the abhorrent acts of evil incarnate, one must either defend the right of fellow human beings to exist and flourish, or become a complicit bystander. This axiom is also what the international community, and in particular the United Nations, was forced to confront. It is out of the crisis of the early 1990s that our strongest instrument for the prevention and elimination of mass atrocities emerged, that is, the responsibility to protect R2P. The responsibility to protect reoriented the discussion of mass atrocities. It reordered our priorities. International peace and security was no longer politics as usual, and the continuation of politics by other means. The definition I'm using here is from the 2001 report by the International Commission on the Intervention in State Sovereignty, ISIS, and it starts off by paying respect to the concept developed by Dr. Francis Deng, who we will all have the pleasure of hearing from in a few moments, that state sovereignty implies responsibility, and the primary responsibility for the protection of its people lies with the state itself. Where a population is suffering serious harm as a result of internal war, insurgency, repression, or state failure, and the state in question is unwilling or unable to halt or avert it, the principle of non-intervention yields to the international responsibility to protect, unquote. There are two reasons why I choose to quote the ISIS report here. First, the report is one of the more telling signposts along the march to mass atrocities prevention. It exemplifies what I described earlier as the narrow contemporary approach to addressing mass atrocities. It draws the line in the sand. If genocide looms and we can prevent it without doing more harm than good, we will stop it. Now, I do not mistake my intentions here. I do not mistake my intentions here. I know that there is a lot more to the ISIS report, of course, than just this. My aim is not to sell short the report. This much will become clear in a moment. The second reason I wanted to refer to the ISIS document is that beyond the central message, which responded to the most pressing issue of the day, the ISIS report outlined the foundations of the concept, set out precautionary and operational principles, and outlined the three key elements of the responsibility to protect, that is, the responsibility to prevent, the responsibility to react, and the responsibility to rebuild. If you recall, when paragraphs 138 and 139 were negotiated and embedded in the 2005 World Summit Outcome Resolution, adopted by the General Assembly, there was a common presentiment that the principles of responsibility to protect had been gutted. After all, it had shrunk from some 100 pages to a measly 2 paragraphs. This sentiment was voiced loudly in 2005 and later. In 2009, at the first informal and interactive debate of responsibility to protect in particular, there was an expert panel on which sat 2 intellectual behemoths and R2P skeptics, Noam Chomsky and Jean Bricmont, who attacked the responsibility to protect doctrine from a different perspective. Bricmont said, and I am paraphrasing somewhat, you have to deal with the causes, and you have to go in depth. You should not think that genocide simply pops out of a box. While I have little patience for such skeptics, he was right on that point. But he was wrong to assume that the supporters of responsibility to protect did not share his concerns to not only stop mass atrocities once they were already underway, but to remedy their causes and prevent them in the first place. Let me remind you humbly, if I may, that the responsibility to protect doctrine, as it was affirmed by the United Nations in paragraphs 138 and 139 of the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document, and embodied in the 3-pillar approach outlined by the United Nations Secretary General, states, first, that each individual state has an enduring responsibility to protect its populations, whether nationals or not, from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, and from their incitement. Second, that the international community has a concomitant responsibility to assist states in meeting those obligations. And finally, or third, that member states of the United Nations have the responsibility to respond collectively in a timely and decisive manner when a state is manifestly failing to provide such protection. In outlining these 3-pillar approach to the responsibility to protect, the Secretary General emphasized, in addition to the equality of all the pillars, the preeminence of prevention. Indeed, the Secretary General wrote that prevention, building on the pillars 1 and 2, is key for the responsibility to protect. There has never been any question that prevention is key, at least theoretically. The ISIS report included the responsibility to prevent and outlined what it may entail. The real difficulty arises in the creation of policy and in its practical implementation. This is where the contributions of the 2009 report and the General Assembly dialogue on R2P, as well as the reports and dialogues that followed in each subsequent year, are so significant, so important. It is in these fora that the special advisors for the prevention of genocide and the responsibility to protect have been working with the missions to the General Assembly and the civil society to expand the apparently sketchy paragraphs of the 2005 outcome document into comprehensive and dynamic policy framework. As the policy lattice has taken shape, a common feature has emerged in the geometry of the framework, and that is the centrality of prevention. Indeed, prevention has been the goal all along. The only true way to eliminate mass atrocities is to prevent them by attacking them in their roots. Yes, if mass atrocities are already underway, as they were in Rwanda in 1994, and I am dismayed to say as they are today in Sudan and in Syria, and we possess the capacity to prevent them, it is absolutely imperative that we act decisively to stop them. We have that responsibility today. Shelter can no longer be sought behind indefensible claims of absolute sovereignty. Sovereignty, in my thought, is no more an absolute. And this goes to the underlying truth of the matter. Early prevention is to be preferred, certainly, to late military intervention. It is for this reason that the development of R2P has been focused on developing early warning mechanisms to identify the signs of unfolding mass atrocities and to facilitate early and decisive action to prevent those indicators from erupting into mass atrocities. The Office of Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide and the Responsibility to Protect, which is the moral voice of prevention and the purveyor of practical tools such as the analysis framework, is the central and pivotal institution to coordinate and accomplish the task of early warning. I put enormous amount of credence in that work, in that structure. In addition to early warning, regional and sub-regional bodies must play a key role, not only for their ability to inform the early warning mechanisms, but because they are best positioned to detect coming mass atrocities and assist member states to fulfill their obligations. That assistance may take a number of forms. It can mean acting as a wise and interested moral voice to encourage conciliation and discourage discrimination, providing development assistance and technical support, or the using of Chapter 8 powers for the establishment of regional arrangements or agencies for the pacific settlement of disputes. Recently, in 2011, the Libyan crisis emphasized the centrality of regional groups. But I think the best example of regional engagement, if we are to remain focused on prevention, was the 2008 Agreement on the Principles of Partnership of the coalition government, which through the leadership of the African Union's panel of eminent African personalities, chaired by former U.S. Secretary General Kofi Annan, helped end the 2007-2008 post-election violence in Kenya, with an election now looming in the next weeks. But we needed to do better than that. If prevention is our goal, then we must act before any violence occurs. And this will require structural and cultural change among the members of the international community, aided by international and domestic civil society groups, academics, private sector, and certainly the media. As I have the pleasure of being hosted here today by both Cardozo Law School and the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, I cannot help but point to the exemplary work being done by both of these institutions. Among its numerous projects, Cardozo has been laboring on the daunting task of outlining evidentiary standards to determine when states should act pursuant to their R2P obligations. This is necessary as enabling the relevant stakeholders to focus on the practical implementation of measures to prevent mass atrocities at the earliest stage possible is central to effective action. With tools like these, we can focus our resources on protecting the most vulnerable people internationally and minimize delays arising from machinations of politics. And heaven knows how that could be complex and stagnant. Furthermore, we can be confident that we will possess the capacity to act preventively. That is because organizations like the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation have been building the capacity of governments to prevent and eliminate mass atrocities by training government officials through its Raphael Lemkin seminars for the prevention of genocide, and by assisting governments, such as that of the United States and Argentina, in developing policy mechanisms specifically geared towards preventing and eliminating mass atrocities. In fact, as was stated earlier on, they have also started work on increasing capacity at the regional level, having recently signed that MOU with the African Union to create an African network for genocide and mass atrocity prevention. And I am happy to say that these are not the only examples of productive civil engagement. Another example worth pointing to is the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect's Focal Point Initiative, which is working to link the relevant executive members of national governments around the world into a global prevention and response secretariat. And there is also the work of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies and the Aegis Trust, who are working with parliamentarians from Canada and United Kingdom, respectively, to advance the prevention and elimination of mass atrocities within their respective parliaments and to building an international network of concerned parliamentarians. I could keep going, but in the interest of time, I simply want to emphasize the crucial role of civil society in the prevention and elimination of mass atrocities, and the fact that civil society actors and the fact that are driving many of the most significant advances in prevention of mass atrocities. They must be applauded for their courage and determination and commitment to this aim. But what is remarkable about the contribution of civil society is what it tells us about where we are in the elimination of mass atrocities. When we are faced with the killing fields, when corporal existence itself is in imminent danger, our tools are very limited. We have little option but to turn towards high politics and hope that the member states of the UN, who have pledged restraint in the use of force, will cooperate with each other and act in the defense of humanity and in a timely fashion. In those circumstances, the risk to both spirit and flesh are dire. On the other hand, when we turn to civil society, to NGOs, to humanitarian actors, and members of national legislatures, it becomes clear that we are now pursuing the elimination of mass atrocities in another way. We are looking beyond the killing fields, to the political fields, the economic fields, the social fields. And that is what true prevention is about. That is what Lemkin had hoped we would do nearly 70 years ago. We are now beginning to identify the underlying and proximate causes of mass atrocities. As we do so, we are gaining an understanding of the tools required to address these causes and how they should be deployed. Most importantly, we now recognize the importance of addressing mass atrocities at the systemic level, where cultural identity is threatened, where economic insecurity and inequality breed famine and instability, and where the political and social rights necessary to human advancement are being stifled. You were probably happy to hear I'm about to conclude. I would like to pause here to draw your attention to something that is of utmost importance to prevention, and that is timing. When we think of prevention, we tend to think of what comes before. Clearly, if we are to prevent a conflict, we must act before the conflict erupts. Well, that is not really the whole picture. To paraphrase what the Secretary General said in last year's report on timely and decisive action, the protection of civilians from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing is an ongoing responsibility. It is not only a question of what needs to be done before atrocities occur, or what needs to be done if they occur, but also what needs to be done after atrocities occur. In other words, to truly actualize the responsibility to prevent, we need to also be cognizant of the responsibility to rebuild, as was described in the 2001 ISIS report. I say this for two reasons. First, atrocities quite literally flow from one another, whether due to our inability to fully address atrocities in the first place or due to containment issues. One of our most intractable humanitarian catastrophes and the site of the UN's most substantial peacekeeping mission is the Democratic Republic of Congo, ripped apart by a conflict that has resulted in the most conflict deaths since the Second World War, and innumerable atrocities, including widespread sexual violence and use of child soldiers. I bring it up because, in many ways, the conflict in the DRC is the progeny of the genocide of 1994 in Rwanda. It is unfinished business. There are many other examples, including the genocide in Darfur, but there is another example that makes the point more directly, I believe. One of the central causes underlying the recent collapse in Mali today was the flood of weapons and fighters that came down from Libya before and after the 2001 civil war. Now, Make no mistake about my point here. Resolution 1973 on the Libyan crisis responded to a real threat with effective action, although I would have far more preferred to see boots on the ground early. Libya was a major victory for protecting civilians from imminent mass atrocities. I think we can agree to that. I did not bring up Libya to discuss any so-called claims of regime change. I brought Libya up because we could have and should have done more to ensure that the appropriate steps were taken after the threat to Libya's population was neutralized. Second, beyond the mere fact that the atrocities tend to flow from each other, there is a very close relationship between the post-atrocity approach and the preventive approach. They both deal with structural, systematic issues and the threat to stability posed by competition. This is by no means to say that they are identical. For example, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration is clearly more closely related to rebuilding than it is to prevention. What I am thinking of is the fact that prevention and rebuilding involve capacity building and development. They both require very similar types of actors and the same systematic approach. In many ways, prevention flows from rebuilding. We cannot prevent the atrocities of the future without also helping survivors and their neighbors recover from those of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been very patient with me. I am most appreciative of your attention through this technological exercise that we've just done. Thank you. Hold on.
So, General Dallaire, if you would indulge us, I think we have time for just a couple questions. Would you mind?
Yes, it's a bit intermittent, but I'll do my best.
Oh, okay. So, please keep the questions brief. We have time for maybe a couple questions. So, Donnie's going to hand out the mic. So, if anyone has any questions, I see none. Is there? Oh, we have one over there. And just speak clearly into the mic so the General can hear you.
General, it's Bill Pace with the International Coalition on Responsibility to Protect. You mentioned the terms regime change at the end of your talk, and that is the way in which the heads of governments of the U.S., the UK, and France reframed the 1970 and 1973 resolutions from protection of civilians to regime change. It seems to be happening again in Syria. Is there any way to try and convince these governments that this type of language is actually impeding our ability to prevent and to resolve mass atrocity prevention rather than in any way helping it? Thank you.
A very perspicacious question. The facile sort of statement of regime change after the fact and looking at the result and using that as an argument for essentially not wanting to engage in a timely fashion and where required with force in responsibility to protect. That whole construct is, in my opinion, a perversion of the aim of the exercise in case. And I would argue that we may have seen a regime change, as an example in Libya, because we went in it half-hearted. It is my opinion that when President Gaddafi said, I will crush these cockroaches and destroy these rats, those were exactly the same words used by the extremists in Rwanda. When he stated that, that was the time that we don't come in with air means, and we pour massive amounts of weapons and assist in training rebel forces that will ultimately bleed to various different levels and create significant instability and difficulties of reconciliation afterwards. That was the time when the international community should have demonstrated that courage of putting boots on the ground and set a line between Gaddafi and the people we were trying to protect, and permit the people that we were protecting in a certain level of serenity to work out the processes that it needed in order to evolve the next stage of democratization of that nation or the restabilization of the nation. And yeah, it might have meant a deal making with Gaddafi, as we did with Charles Taylor, and God knows subsequently what would have happened with him, as we've seen with Charles Taylor. But not putting that line in the sand deliberately, and on the contrary, supporting a fighting element that created ultimately a near chaotic scenario on the ground that ultimately ran away with the exercise and caused this regime change, was, in my opinion, a very poor demonstration of our willingness to truly commit to R2P and to protecting civilians. No boots on the ground meant we really didn't have the guts to put what we felt was really essential to protect those people. On the contrary, we just gave them tools to fight their fight and assist them in that fight, and ultimately create, I think, much more instability, to which certainly the Russians and the Chinese have argued was worse than what was there before. And that's my short answer on that one.
Okay, another brief question? Brief question. Okay, we have one right here in the front. Oh, sorry, I can't see the column, so we'll go over there.
Elizabeth White, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Center for the Prevention of Genocide. Following up on your remarks about R2P in Libya, what do you think the prescription for R2P in Syria is?
And I'm not sure I picked up the question. Is the application of R2P for Syria? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Why are we so late in the game? In one horrible sort of personal analysis, I looked at Syria and I said, you know, maybe he hasn't killed enough people to really make us be prepared to intervene and be prepared to take casualties in the intervention. And that really has been haunting me in why we have stagnated so much in the Syrian exercise. I can understand the political toing and froing that goes on in the Security Council, and I can certainly understand them using and abusing the Libyan experience to sort of hedge their bets and hold back. And even the United States in that context. But what is really the essence of how to restabilize a situation that's gone catastrophic? And I am not for one to say that we must always use force, but I am for one to say that if we have created the doctrine that has all those processes, and including the use of force and all the rules that engage in the use of force, it seems to me that we should play them all out to the extent where ultimately we say it is working or it is not. And right now, nobody really even wants to use the term R2P in the discussion, let alone, I believe, wanting to commit. And so I'm left, as I sometimes remembered, and this is what the sort of the real pejorative side of this situation in Syria, is I'm left there as I was on a number of days in Rwanda, wondering how many bodies had to float down those rivers, and how many statistical demonstrations that I could present of the scale of the atrocities and the fact that it was not going to end, it was going to continue until elimination was achieved. How much of that is still required basically today to provide world leaders, world politicians, not world statesmen, because we don't have any right now, world politicians to have the courage to commit early on and with the extensive use of resources that they have. Syria brings me back far too often to Rwanda and a bit of a pessimism at that time. Thank you.
Okay. A last question right here.
Stephen Tebbit from Cameroon. You talked about early warning, and we know that with the case of Libya, or the after effects of Libya, African presidents complained early on that the weapons from the Libyan arsenal were spreading down into sub-Saharan Africa and were going to be a problem later on. Nothing was ever done. Even the United Nations representative in Darfur complained about the spread of the weapons from Libya, and no attempt was made to harness those weapons. Eventually we have what happened in Mali. With Libya itself, there were early warnings that after Gaddafi fell, there would be social chaos. And even the social programs that he had put there were not sustained after he left, and led to the different factions in Libya now fighting each other. And in fact, more people have been killed since Gaddafi left than he had killed before the United Nations and the Western powers intervened. Yet we know that Libya had enough money in the West, in France, in Britain, in Italy, and in the United States, for the social programs to continue, which would have alleviated the social chaos that followed the fall of Gaddafi. What is the responsibility of the international community, and especially those who brought about that chaos, in the resolution of the problems and the genocides that are happening after that?
I must say the communications are quite difficult there, and I'm taking the question as the post-Libya scenario and how we in fact handled or did not handle the post-Libya scenario in regards to stabilizing and ultimately even curtailing the redistribution of weapons and also a lot of the mercenaries who fought there. It is incredible how we have a sense of history that's really a sort of CNN history. CNN history is what happened last week. And so if it goes beyond last week, it is difficult to sustain the commitment into a situation that is still evolving. I mean, once the regime fell and the situation then was very complex, we tended to Pontius Pilate ourselves out of the responsibility to protect the situation, even though, interestingly enough, with the Libya, although Canada provided significant air forces, it never used the term responsibility to protect. But anyways, that last pillar of responsibility to protect doesn't seem to be on the radar screen to any significant fashion. And so what is happening inside a nation and the catastrophic failure that goes on and the extent of it, as we've been seeing, is not contained inside a nation state, its borders. It will have a regional impact. And one would have thought we would have learned that since Rwanda and even with the Darfur situation, but we didn't with Libya, and we're seeing Mali, and God knows what else will be evolving. And so I just think that we sort of abandoned the last pillar of R2P and are now picking up the pieces of that last pillar being left to the side, a destabilization of not only still that country, but the region, because the tools we use were so half-hearted and ineffective.
Let's see if we can get him back. Let him finish his sentence. Let me try. Oh, it's here.
I think there was a subversive element in the communications here in Canada.
We have you back on audio. Can you hear us?
I'm afraid I must carry on because our little crisis up here is continuing, and I've got to get back to the Senate.
Okay, great.
And so, if I may excuse myself and only say that I wish you well today, and I am particularly happy to know that your next forum with Francis Deng and Ed Luck and Juan Mendez will be a most dynamic one, and they have been in the trenches of this R2P, so push them to give you some innovative answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. And it seems technology strikes again. But I would like, while we are transitioning into the next panel, oh, you are back with video. Thank you very much, Senator, for your contribution. And we are looking forward to your work in this matter. Thank you. So while we are transitioning into the next panel, I would also like to mention some very important partners that have contributed to making today possible. And not only today, but also the book project that Sherry mentioned, and that we hope will bring together quite an interesting overview of the field of genocide prevention, or what is genocide prevention. I'm even afraid of calling it a field. So I would like to just mention for their partnership and their support, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung that has been working for quite a while now with the Auschwitz Institute, and it's one of our green, reliable friends in the entire world in our programs. And we want to thank them for their support for this conference, and also ask you to go to their information table that's next to the check-in table and check out what they are working on lately in terms of transatlantic dialogue and many other issues here in DC and around the world. Sebastian Grefe is representing the Heinrich Böll Stiftung today here. Then I would like to thank Joyce Apsol and the Institute for the Study of Genocide for their contribution to thinking about the book and making the book happen, and the entire concept of the conference and our public outreach happen. We are always grateful for her and the Institute's dedicated support. And last but not least, I would like to thank to the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, to the entire team at the Carnegie Council that is going to make sure that today's proceedings will be archived on their website and available to anybody who would like to consult these proceedings in the future. And now I would like to invite the panelists for panel number 1 to take the stage and discuss about the Office of the Special Advisors.